A wedding is a very special day for a woman, isn't it? For Isabel Morgan, that day was the beginning of the end. She cried before, during, and after the ceremony. They weren't tears of joy, but of resignation. While other women were getting married for love or a dream, Isabel was being pushed down an aisle with no flowers, no celebration, and no future. In the Morgan mansion, which had once been synonymous with luxury and status, the silence was almost suffocating. The wedding dress, with its impeccable white lace, hung from a chair in the corner of the room. To Isabel it looked like a battle uniform, the last piece of armor in a war she hadn't chosen to fight. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face between her hands. She was trying to control her breathing as she heard muffled voices in the corridor. At that moment, everything seemed so distant. The opulence of the mansion, the pomp of the Morgan surname. None of it mattered anymore. They were broke. The bedroom door opened sharply, making Isabel look up quickly. Francis Morgan entered, accompanied by William, Isabel's father. Francis had a hard face, her eyes shining with impatience. William, as always, remained in the background, his hands in his pockets and his gaze downcast. "Isabel, we don't have time for your drama," Francis snapped, approaching the bed where her daughter was sitting. "Put the dress on now." "I don't want to do this," mumbled Isabel, her voice breaking. "It's not fair. It's not fair to me." Francis crossed her arms, exhaling a sigh of frustration. "Fair? Do you think life is fair? We're about to lose everything, Isabel, everything. What do you want, for me and your father to be humiliated in public? For this family to become a joke?" Isabel looked at her mother, tears streaming down her face. "Why always me? Why not Olivia? She's your favorite. She always was." The words escaped before she could control them, but they were truths she had held in for years. Olivia, her older sister, had always been the star of the Morgan family. While Isabel received orders and chores, Olivia received praise and applause. Even now, while the family was facing collapse, Olivia was in Paris, living her dream as a model. Francis narrowed her eyes. "Olivia has a bright future ahead of her. She has talent, Isabel. She's special. And frankly, she wouldn't have the strength you have to deal with it." "Strength?" Isabel repeated with a bitter laugh. "No, Mom, you don't think I'm strong. You just don't care enough about me to spare me. I'm just the spare part when Olivia can't or won't do something." Francis huffed, exuding frustration. "We don't have time for this. Stop playing the victim." "Francis," William finally intervened, his voice low and hesitant. He looked at his wife but didn't dare challenge her. "Let's take it easy. Isabel knows what she has to do." Isabel turned to her father, looking for some support, some attempt at protection, but all she saw was the same resignation as always. William was a man who didn't know how to stand up to Francis. He knew how to stay in the shadows, comfortable in his silence, while her mother did the dirty work. Francis approached again, leaning towards Isabel. Her tone lowered, becoming more threatening, but she said nothing more. "I expect you ready in 15 minutes. Don't make me come back here." Without looking back, Francis left the room, leaving William in an awkward silence. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Isabel, I know it's hard, but in the end you'll understand that there was no other way out." He lightly touched his daughter's shoulder before leaving too, closing the door behind him. Isabel remained seated, staring at her dress. Her father's words brought her no comfort. They were just a reminder that she was alone. "There's no other way out." She stood up slowly, picked up the dress, and began to put it on. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the fabric on her body. When she had finished, she looked in the mirror. She didn't recognize the woman she saw. The ceremony took place in the private hospital where Theodore Blake, the billionaire heir to Blake Enterprises, was hospitalized. The accident that had left him in a coma months earlier had made all the headlines. Now, that same man, immobile in a bed, was the Morgans' lifeline. Isabel entered the room holding the bouquet with trembling fingers. The fluorescent lights made the atmosphere even colder, inhuman. Theodore lay there, surrounded by machines and monitors. The judge read out the votes in a monotone voice, as if he were narrating a report. Isabel could barely hear the words. When it was her turn to say yes, it was as if the words stuck in her throat. She looked into the sleeping face of Theodore, the man who was now technically her husband. "You've always been the practical one." Her mother's words echoed in her mind as she forced her lips to move. Yes. It was a yes to the ruin of her own life. When the judge had finished, Isabel left the room without looking back. In the corridor, Francis was waiting, arms crossed. "Well done." Her mother gave her a dry smile, but there was no trace of tenderness on her face. "You did what needed to be done." Isabel didn't answer. She wanted to get out of there. She wanted to run, to disappear. Her legs were heavy, but she still started walking, determined to get away from that conversation, from that life. "Isabel." Francis's voice cut through the silence, cold and harsh. Isabel stopped, feeling a shiver run down her spine. She turned slowly and saw her mother approaching, her gaze filled with something dark. Francis held her daughter's arm tightly, preventing her from continuing. "Don't you dare run away," Francis said, lowering her voice to an almost threatening tone. "Or I'll expose the whole truth." Isabel's blood ran cold. She looked at her mother, confused and terrified. She didn't understand what Francis meant, but the intensity in her eyes was enough to terrify her. "Francis!" William's voice came from down the hall. He walked quickly over to them, his face downcast. "This has gone far enough." "Be quiet, William," Francis replied without looking away from Isabel. "Don't say anything, Francis," he insisted, holding his wife's arm gently but firmly enough to interrupt her. "Not now." For a moment the corridor was silent. Francis released Isabel's arm with a sudden movement but said nothing more. William looked at her, as if begging for a truce, while Isabel remained motionless, feeling like a puppet attached to strings she couldn't control. She didn't know what her mother meant by exposing the truth. She didn't know what William was trying to avoid, but in that instant she knew one thing for sure. Whatever it was, it could destroy her. And as the silence spread through the corridor, Isabel took a step back. The only thing she wanted was to get out of there. Isabel stood motionless in the corridor, feeling her arm still sore from where her mother had squeezed it tightly. Francis' threat echoed in her mind like distant thunder. "I'm going to expose the whole truth." But what truth was that? What terrible secret did her mother seem to be keeping? She looked at them both, trying to keep her breathing under control as her father stared at her with a tired, almost pitying look. Francis, on the other hand, was impassive. Her face was a mask of determination, but Isabel could see something else there. It was anger, not a passing anger, but something deep-rooted, something Francis had been harboring for a long time. Isabel took a step back, intending to walk away, but she stopped. There was something about her mother that made her uneasy. Francis was willing to do anything to protect her family, but Isabel had the feeling that this protection came at too high a price, and so she hesitated. She didn't run away as her mind and body begged her to do. She stayed still in silence because she wanted to listen. She wanted to find out what her mother was so keen to expose and why her father seemed determined to stop her. The silence in the corridor was heavy. Francis crossed her arms and turned to William, who was watching her as if he were trying to defuse a bomb. "Francis, that's enough," William said, in a low but firm tone. He waved his hand, indicating that they should stop. "This is not the time." Francis narrowed her eyes, clearly frustrated. "If she keeps acting like a spoiled child, I won't have a choice." Isabel held her breath. "Francis," William tried again, this time closer to her, lowering his voice even more. "Please, not here. Not now." They were close enough that Isabel could only hear fragments of what they were saying. Even so, the words seemed to sharpen her curiosity like blades. "I've had enough, William. How many times do I have to—" "Let's not discuss it here," he whispered back nervously. "You promised." Isabel felt her heart race. How many times had she witnessed this kind of scene? How many times had her mother approached her with something to say, only to be interrupted by William? Memories began to flood her mind and she felt suffocated. Years ago, when she was 12, Isabel was in the back garden of the mansion, alone as usual, when Francis approached her. There was something strange about the way her mother looked at her that afternoon, as if she were assessing her. "Isabel," "I need you to know something," Francis began, but stopped when William appeared through the kitchen door. He called his wife by name, his tone neutral but direct. Francis recoiled immediately, looking at him with an expression that Isabel couldn't decipher at the time. Later, Francis acted as if nothing had happened. And there was another time at 17 when her mother almost told her something after a tense dinner. Isabel was in her room, leafing through a book, when Francis came in, hesitating. "Isabel, your life isn't—" Francis began, but stopped when William appeared in the doorway, catching her eye. "Can we talk?" he said, his tone firmer this time. And now, years later, in that hospital corridor, Isabel felt she was facing the same scene, but with much more at stake. Her mother was about to explode, but her father was still the barrier that kept everything contained. Francis lowered her voice even more, but Isabel made a point of standing there, motionless, to hear what she could. "She has a right to know, William. You can't hide it forever." What did that mean? Isabel felt her heart race even faster, a mixture of curiosity and fear growing inside her. "Francis, we've been over this." William clenched his teeth, clearly trying to control the tension. "Not here." "And where then? At her funeral? When it's too late?" Francis retorted, her tone full of irony and bitterness. William flinched slightly, as if the words had hit a nerve. He looked at the floor for a moment, seeming to search for an answer, but he couldn't find one. Isabel pressed her hands against the sides of her body, trying not to lose control. This was too much. "What are you talking about?" she finally asked, her voice shaky but firm enough to cut off their conversation. Francis and William froze. They both turned to her at the same time, but it was as if they were seeing a different person. For a moment, no one said anything. Francis was the first to regain control. "Nothing you need to worry about, Isabel," Francis replied, with the icy calm she used to use to end arguments. "Don't lie to me, Mom." Isabel stepped forward, her eyes shining with tears and anger. "You just said there's something I need to know. What truth is that?" Francis opened her mouth to speak, but William held up his hand, interrupting her. "Isabel, this isn't the right moment." He looked at her with an expression that seemed to beg for patience. "Trust me. Trust me." Those words resounded in her mind, like an empty echo. There was no trust there. Not after years of being ignored, used and pushed into the background while Olivia shone. Not after everything her mother had said that day. She shook her head, feeling the tears run down her face. "You expect me to trust you after all this? After forcing me into this marriage?" William seemed about to answer, but Francis took the lead as always. "Isabel, you've done your bit. Now go home and finish packing your things." Isabel blinked, confused. "What?" Francis crossed her arms, as if the authoritative tone was enough to avoid explanations. "There's a lot to do before your fiancé, Theodore, arrives at his mansion. I've been told that the master bedroom is being prepared for the two of you. I want you to finish packing and get organized to move in today." Those words hit Isabel like a slap. Her mother spoke as if marriage had been just a detail, as if handing over her freedom and her life to a comatose stranger was something trivial. "Home?" Isabel repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Is that all you have to say?" She looked from Francis to William, but her father ducked his head, avoiding her gaze. Francis, on the other hand, remained impassive. "I did everything you asked. I married a man who doesn't even know me. I signed the paperwork, I took part in the farce. And now you want me to pretend that this is my life?" "It's not pretending, Isabel," Francis retorted, her tone as cold as ice. "It's your life now. Accept that and move on." Isabel felt a lump forming in her throat, but she didn't want to cry in front of her mother. She didn't want to give that woman the pleasure of seeing her broken. She clenched her fists, her anger burning inside, but she couldn't find the words to reply. She turned and started walking down the corridor, trying to get out of there as quickly as possible, but stopped when she heard Francis' voice again. "Isabel." She froze. The tone was different now, darker, almost threatening. Slowly, she turned to face her mother once more. "No matter what happens, remember that everything I did was to protect this family." The words hung in the air like a veiled threat. Francis just watched her with an expression that mixed coldness and something Isabel couldn't identify. Without saying anything, Isabel turned again and continued walking. Her legs felt shaky, as if they were going to collapse at any moment. As she walked away, she heard Francis's low voice whispering to William, "She'll have to get used to it." Isabel hastened her step, wishing she would never hear that voice again. But as much as she tried to run away, the feeling that something much bigger was behind everything haunted her. There was something her mother was hiding, and Isabel was sure that finding out would be her downfall, but she didn't know which was worse right now. Discovering this secret or moving in with a stranger who was her husband, Isabel entered the house with faltering steps, the weight of the last few hours still crushing her chest. As soon as the door closed behind her, she felt the tears she had been holding back finally fall. They burned her face, but there was no longer any way of holding them back. She looked around at the house, which now seemed a strange place. As much as it was the Morgan family mansion, nothing there made her feel really at home. Everything was cold, calculated. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall had been chosen by Francis to display a false perfection. The home had never been welcoming. She climbed the stairs almost without thinking, her legs heavy and her eyes blurred. When she reached her bedroom, she closed the door behind her, shutting out the world outside. Isabel leaned against the wood, her heart still racing, and slid to the floor, hugging her knees. She cried like she hadn't in years. It wasn't just the wedding, the stranger who was now her husband, or the threat from her mother. It was everything, her whole life. The room around her seemed to squeeze her. It was small, with furniture that had long since lost its luster. The bed, made of dark wood, creaked whenever she moved. The curtains, faded by time, were the same as they had been since she was a teenager. Isabel felt her throat tighten as she looked at the space around her, because that room had always been the symbol of who she was in the Morgan family. A smaller, forgotten piece, a space that no one really valued. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the pain, but the memories came like an avalanche. When they were children, Olivia had the biggest room in the mansion. Francis had decorated it with care, choosing flowery wallpapers, delicate white furniture, and even a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Every detail was designed to exalt the beauty and status of her eldest daughter. Olivia had it all. Isabel's room, on the other hand, was functional. No special decoration, no attention to detail. The furniture was Olivia's old furniture, transferred when Francis decided to renovate her eldest daughter's space. Isabel grew up surrounded by used things, inherited clothes and repressed dreams. She remembered a night when she was just 8 years old. She was sitting on the floor of Olivia's room, admiring the new doll her sister had given her as a present. She was beautiful, with blonde hair and a blue satin dress. Isabel, with small, trembling hands, asked to hold it. "Don't touch her," Olivia shouted, pulling the doll towards her. Isabel looked at her mother, expecting Francis to intervene, but her mother just gave Olivia an indulgent smile. "Isabel, you have your own things. You don't have to take your sister's." But Isabel didn't. Her dolls were old, some missing pieces, with faded clothes that she sewed herself to try to renew them. At that moment she realized that no matter how much she wanted something, nothing would ever truly be hers. Later, as a teenager, while Olivia was taken to parties and events, Isabel stayed at home. Francis insisted that she had to help organize the mansion or study in order to be useful. "You need to be practical, Isabel. You can't afford to dream like Olivia." It was these words, repeated over the years, that shaped Isabel. They created a woman who didn't know how to dream, who didn't know how to fight for herself, because she always believed it wasn't worth it. She remembered an evening when the two sisters were in the living room. Olivia had just returned from a gala dinner with Francis, wearing a shiny dress that looked like it had come out of a magazine. Isabel was folding clothes that Francis had asked her to organize. "You should dress like Olivia, Isabel," Francis said, watching her with a critical eye. "Maybe that would attract a little more attention." The words hit Isabel like a punch, but she just put her head down and continued folding her clothes. Olivia, of course, just smiled, as if she were absorbing all the brilliance that her sister lacked. In the present, sitting on the floor of her bedroom, Isabel felt those open wounds once again. The memories came one after the other like sharp knives. Francis' voice, the disapproving looks, the comparisons with Olivia. Everything weighed on her shoulders like invisible chains. She looked at the half-open suitcase in the corner of the room. There wasn't much to put in there. A few clothes, a few personal items. Isabel didn't have many things that were really hers. Most of what was in that room was inherited or chosen by Francis. She stood up slowly, her eyes swollen from crying. She walked over to her suitcase and began to put some clothes away with automatic movements. Each piece she put in was like a reminder of her own insignificance in the Morgan family. It was then that she heard firm footsteps in the hallway. Her heart stopped for a second before the door opened abruptly. Francis entered the room with her usual serious face and impeccable posture. "Are you ready?" Her voice was cold, impersonal, as if she were talking to a maid, not her own daughter. "We're leaving in a few minutes." Isabel looked up, trying to hide her tears. "It's almost ready." Francis looked around, as if assessing Isabel's progress. "That's great. I want you to be there when Theodore arrives. He needs you by his side." Isabel felt her anger rising but swallowed her words. She didn't want to give her mother the satisfaction of seeing her break down again. She just nodded, going back to folding her clothes. Francis watched for a few more seconds before turning to leave. "Don't be long, I don't like delays." And with that, Francis left, closing the door behind her. Isabel stopped fiddling with her suitcase, taking a deep breath as the silence took over the room once again. She felt like she was being pushed into the unknown, with no one by her side. Silent tears streamed down her face as she looked at the suitcase and the small room that now seemed smaller than ever. She knew that from that moment on, everything she had, no matter how little, would cease to exist. She finished her suitcase and walked out to the car. The silence in the car was almost palpable. Isabel stared out of the window, watching the landscape go by, but her mind was far away, lost in the events of that day. Everything seemed surreal. Married to a man she didn't know, forced to leave the house she had grown up in, as cold as it was, and now on her way to an unknown mansion. Sitting in the front seat, Francis was visibly excited. Her discreet but constant smile revealed the thoughts that were swirling around in her mind. "Well, Isabel, I guess you were lucky after all." Francis finally broke the silence, adjusting the pearl necklace around her neck. "Theodore is from one of the richest families in the country. You would never have managed such a marriage on your own." Isabel felt her chest tighten. Her mother's words were a cruel reminder of how she was perceived. Francis continued, ignoring her daughter's silence. "Richard Blake was very generous to accept this arrangement. He needed someone to be by his son's side, someone to take on the role of wife. And now you have the chance to live as you always dreamed." "As I've always dreamed?" Isabel murmured, her voice laden with irony. "Yes." Francis smiled to herself. "Think of the money, the comfort, the security. It's priceless. Richard is paying handsomely for his dedication." William, in the driver's seat, drove in silence, as he always did. He didn't dare interrupt Francis, but Isabel could see the tension in his hands, which gripped the steering wheel tightly. Isabel looked out of the window again, clenching her fists. What her mother saw as good fortune looked more like a prison sentence for her. When the car drove through the gates of the Blake mansion, Isabel couldn't contain her little gasp of surprise. The estate was immense. The cobbled driveway led to a grand, white-fronted building with imposing columns and tall windows. Perfectly manicured gardens surrounded the house, and a fountain with marble statues sparkled in the evening light. "Wow," Francis let out, looking at the mansion with wide eyes. "Deep down, Isabel, you really lucked out. Look at that. I never imagined that anyone in our family could live like this." Isabel didn't reply. Her mother's comment didn't surprise her, but it did increase the lump in her throat. Francis seemed more fascinated by the Blakes' wealth than worried about what was happening to her daughter. As soon as the car stopped, two of the mansion's employees approached to help them. Francis got down first, looking around as if to memorize every detail. Isabel got out soon after, feeling the cold wind on her face. Richard Blake appeared at the entrance to the mansion, a haughty man with a calculating gaze. He greeted Francis with a nod, but kept his distance. "Theodore will be arriving soon. I hope your daughter is prepared to take on his responsibilities," Richard said bluntly. Francis smiled politely. "Isabel is more than ready. I'm sure she'll make a wonderful wife for Theodore." Isabel felt a chill when she heard these words, but remained silent. After a few more minutes of superficial conversation, Frances decided to leave. She turned to Isabel, smoothing her daughter's shoulders with a gesture that should have seemed comforting, but was far from it. "Be strong, Isabel. You're doing the right thing." And with that, Frances got into the car again. William followed her in silence, casting one last glance at Isabel before starting the engine and driving off. As the car disappeared through the gate, Isabel stood still for a moment, feeling completely alone. Just then, Theodore arrived. The private ambulance pulled up at the entrance to the mansion, and Isabel followed the staff carrying the stretcher inside. Her heart was racing as she walked behind them, past corridors decorated with classical paintings and luxurious furniture. Everything there seemed straight out of a movie. When they reached the room prepared for Theodore, Isabel was silent as the doctors and nurses adjusted the equipment around the bed. Theodore was lying there, motionless, breathing with the help of apparatus. She approached him hesitantly, looking closely at his face for the first time. It was a face she had seen before in magazines, on TV, always associated with lavish parties and important events. He was handsome, but now he seemed fragile, vulnerable. Something touched Isabel's heart at that moment. As much as she felt anger and resentment at her situation, Theodore didn't just seem like a stranger. He seemed like someone who had lost as much as she had. After the doctors had finished installing everything, the team left, leaving Isabel alone in the room with Theodore. The silence was almost oppressive, interrupted only by the sounds of the machines around the bed. Isabel pulled a chair close and sat down next to him. For a moment she just stared, trying to understand how her life had come to this. "Hi, Theodore." Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. "I'm your wife. We got married earlier." She hesitated, searching for words. "I hope I can look after you here. I'm sure your life was very different before that, as was mine." She took a deep breath, the tears threatening to return. "This might be better for me than the house I grew up in. There, I never received real love from my parents." Isabel swallowed, feeling a lump in her throat. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope we can find some peace here." She rested her head on the arm of the chair, exhausted. The emotions of the day were finally taking their toll. In a few minutes, Isabel fell asleep there next to Theodore while the soft light of the lamp illuminated the room. The next morning, Isabel was awoken by a sound at the door. She opened her eyes slowly, trying to understand where she was. Then she remembered the Blake mansion, the wedding, Theodore. When she looked at the door, she saw a woman standing there, dressed impeccably in a beige silk outfit. Her hair was tied up in a perfect bun, and her eyes appraised Isabel with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "So you're my son's wife?" Isabel felt her heart race. It was Clarissa Blake, Theodore's mother. Isabel quickly got up from Theodore's side, her face still marked by tiredness. She stood still for a moment, her legs trembling as she looked at the woman in the doorway. "Good morning, ma'am." Her voice came out timid, hesitant. Clarissa Blake took a few steps into the room, assessing Isabel carefully. Her clear eyes analyzed every detail, but instead of suspicion, there was something soft in her expression. "Please, call me Clarissa." She smiled, approaching Theodore's bed. Her gaze fell on her son, and Isabel saw hope flicker in his eyes like a flame that refused to go out. "So, you're Isabel?" "Yes, ma'am." "Clarissa." Isabel quickly corrected herself, a slight blush taking over her face. "Did you stay here with him overnight?" Clarissa asked, her voice full of surprise and tenderness at the same time. Isabel nodded. "I felt comfortable here." Clarissa looked at her for a moment and then smiled again, this time with more warmth. "That's good to know," she sighed, adjusting a fold in the sheet covering Theodore. "My son needs someone by his side. It's hard to see him like this, but I believe with all my heart that he will wake up one day." Isabel noticed the strength behind Clarissa's words. It was as if this woman refused to accept the reality that the doctors had probably explained to her countless times. "I'll do my best," Isabel said, her voice still low but sincere. Clarissa turned to her again. "I know you will. I can see that you're a good person, Isabel. Richard may be pragmatic, but I trust my instincts. You'll be good company for him, and perhaps an important part of his recovery." Isabel felt a lump in her throat. Clarissa's confidence was unexpected, but it brought a sense of comfort that she hadn't known she needed. The days passed, and Isabel and Clarissa became closer. Clarissa, initially formal and reserved, gradually opened up to Isabel. The two began to spend their afternoons together, talking about Theodore, the mansion, and even Clarissa's dreams for the future. Clarissa was full of praise for her daughter-in-law, delighted with her patience and dedication. When Isabel spent hours by Theodore's side talking to him, adjusting the sheets or reading a book aloud, Clarissa watched her with a discreet smile. "He's lucky to have you, Isabel," Clarissa said one afternoon while the two of them were having tea in the living room. "I just hope I'm doing enough," Isabel replied humbly. "You're already doing more than most people would." Those words were the first that had really made Isabel feel valued in years. As well as spending time with Clarissa and looking after Theodore, Isabel began to look for something to fill her spare time. She had never liked feeling useless, and the idea of spending her days just waiting for life to happen made her restless. One day, while exploring the mansion's immense library, she came across some books on finance and investments. Curious, she started leafing through them and was soon immersed in the texts. Isabel had always been a dedicated student. Even in the Morgan household, where she received no encouragement, she found solace in books. Little by little, that routine began to take shape. Isabel spent her mornings studying investments and personal finance, writing down concepts and strategies in a notebook. In the afternoons, she devoted herself to Theodore and often helped Clarissa with small projects around the house. The weeks turned into months, and Isabel felt something strange growing inside her, a little peace. Despite all the sacrifices, she was beginning to feel that there was something there that she could call life. One afternoon, Isabel was sitting in the library with a pile of books around her, scribbling notes in her notebook, when she heard Clarissa's voice calling her from the living room. "Isabel, there's someone here to see you." She frowned in surprise. She hadn't expected visitors. When she went downstairs, she saw Francis standing in the doorway with the same stiff, elegant posture as always. "Mother?" Isabel asked, feeling a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Francis smiled, but Isabel realized that there was something calculated in that smile. "Isabel, darling, how are you?" Francis approached, reaching out to take her daughter's hands. "This house is wonderful, isn't it? You're doing so well here. Really, you're lucky." Isabel took a step back, crossing her arms. "What do you want, Mom? You've never been here since I got married." Francis hesitated for a second, but then resumed her confident posture. "I need your help, Isabel." Her voice was firm, but Isabel could see the hidden nervousness. "Things at home aren't going very well, Aunt yet. I thought maybe you could help us." "Help how?" "Well," Francis gave a small smile, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "You're married to Theodore Blake, one of the richest men in the country. I thought I could convince his family to lend us something." Isabel blinked, shocked. "A loan? Or something simpler?" Francis continued, feigning casualness. "A car, perhaps, or one of the smaller properties, something we could sell to pay off some debts." Isabel felt her stomach turn. It wasn't just Francis's absurd suggestion, but the way she spoke, as if it were something normal, acceptable. "Are you serious?" Isabel asked, her voice shaking with indignation. "Of course I am, Isabel. You know how we are. It's not as if it's such a difficult thing for them." Clarissa appeared in the room at that moment, watching the scene with a puzzled expression. "Isabel, are you all right?" she asked, clearly trying to understand the tension in the air. Isabel took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Yes, everything's fine." She looked at Francis, her heart racing. "Mum, I think you'd better leave." Francis's eyes widened. "What?" "You heard me," Isabel said, more firmly now. "I'm not going to ask the Blake family for anything, let alone take anything from them to solve the problems you've created." Francis stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. "Isabel, don't be ungrateful. I did it for you. I did all this for our family." "No, Mum," Isabel interrupted, her voice firm but full of pain. "You did it for yourself, and now you're trying to use me again." Francis stood still for a moment, surprised by her daughter's attitude, but she soon pulled herself together, casting one last glance at Isabel before turning to leave. "You'll regret this," she said, before walking through the door and disappearing. Clarissa approached Isabel, touching her shoulder gently. "Is everything all right?" Isabel nodded, although she felt a weight on her chest. "Yes, I just need a moment." Clarissa didn't insist. She just gave her a small smile before walking away, leaving Isabel alone in the room. Isabel took a deep breath, feeling the tears threaten to fall. It wasn't just the pain of yet another disappointment with her mother. It was the realization that, for the first time, she had said no, and maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something new. Isabel stayed in the room for a few minutes after Francis left, trying to regain control of herself. Her thoughts were a mess, but something inside her prevented her from letting herself sink again. For the first time in years, she had stood up to her mother and refused to be manipulated. When Clarissa returned, Isabel stood up quickly. "Clarissa, I'm sorry." Her voice came out hurried, full of regret. "I'm sorry about that scene. My mother, she—" Clarissa interrupted with a soft gesture. "There's no need to apologize, Isabel." She sat down in one of the nearby armchairs, watching her with kind eyes. "I understood enough." Isabel hesitated, but eventually sat down too. There was something about Clarissa that made her feel safer, as if she could let off steam without being judged. She had always been like that. Isabel began, her restless hands resting in her lap. "My mother was never exactly loving towards me." Clarissa tilted her head, encouraging her to continue. "Everything was about Olivia." Isabel smiled bitterly. "My sister was always the favorite, the star of the family. I got attention, love, everything. I was practical. I was the one who did what was necessary, who took responsibility." "And she never recognized that?" Clarissa asked softly. Isabel shook her head, feeling the lump in her throat return. "No. In fact, she always made it clear that I should be grateful for what little I had." Isabel laughed humorlessly, trying to mask her pain. "My whole life has been about pleasing, obeying, so never about me." Clarissa sighed, placing her hand on Isabel's. "I'm sorry you had to go through that. No mother should treat her daughter like that." The simple but sincere words made Isabel's eyes water again. "Thank you for saying that," Isabel replied, squeezing Clarissa's hand lightly. Clarissa was silent for a moment, seeming to consider something. Finally, she spoke. "Isabel, there's something I want to discuss with you." Isabel looked up, confused. Clarissa's tone was more serious now, but there was still a comforting warmth there. "What is it?" Clarissa hesitated for a moment, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I've spent so long here, looking after Theodore, hoping for a miracle, and I still believe that he will wake up." Her voice was charged with emotion. "But in the meantime, this house, there's something missing here. Life is missing." Isabel frowned, not understanding what Clarissa was getting at. "I've always dreamed of having grandchildren," Clarissa continued, her eyes shining. "A big family, full of movement and joy, and considering the circumstances." Isabel felt her stomach turn as she realized what Clarissa was suggesting. "You're saying that maybe we can bring new life into this house," Clarissa added, with a gentle smile. "I know that Theodore and Richard had discussed this in the past, and Theodore, cautious as ever, had left samples in storage." Isabel's heart raced. The idea seemed absurd, almost unreal, but Clarissa continued before she could protest. "I don't want to pressure you, Isabel, but I think it could be good for all of us, and for you, for Theodore, for the family." "That's a lot to process," Isabel mumbled, feeling overwhelmed. "I know." Clarissa put her hand on Isabel's arm. "Think about it. We don't have to decide now." That night, Isabel found it hard to sleep. The idea of having a child, especially in such unusual circumstances, was something that had never crossed her mind. But at the same time, she thought about the life she had been leading up to that moment, marked by loneliness, a lack of purpose, and the constant weight of other people's expectations. Could this be an opportunity to create something new? The next morning, Clarissa brought up the subject again over breakfast. This time, Richard was present. He had been briefed on the idea and seemed to agree. "Isabel, I want you to know that no one is going to force you into anything. Richard began with his typical direct tone, "but I think this is an opportunity for all of us." "An opportunity?" Isabel asked, still uncertain. "Yes, it is." Richard nodded. "Theodore is the heir to this family. His legacy is important to all of us, but above all, we want to bring something positive to this house. A son can be that change." Isabel looked at Clarissa, who was watching everything with a hopeful, almost anxious look. "I need to think about it," Isabel said honestly. Clarissa and Richard nodded, respecting her space. After a few days of reflection, Isabel made her decision. As strange as the situation was, something inside her told her that it could be an opportunity, not just for the Blakes, but for herself. She met Clarissa in the living room that afternoon. "I'm going," Isabel finally said. "We can make an appointment." Clarissa smiled, relieved and excited. "You won't regret it, Isabel, I'm sure of it." The following week, Isabel, Clarissa and Richard went to the clinic to discuss the possibilities with a specialized doctor. The professional explained the procedures, detailing how Theodore's samples could be used for artificial insemination. Isabel listened carefully, but her heart was still racing. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Clarissa asked as they were leaving the clinic. Isabel took a deep breath, looking at the woman who was now more of a mother to her than Francis had ever been. "I do." She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt in control of her own choice. The days leading up to the procedure at the clinic were tense for everyone at the Blake mansion. Clarissa and Richard were visibly apprehensive, but tried to hide their anxiety. Isabel, for her part, oscillated between anticipation and fear. Despite everything, she had decided to go ahead. For the first time, she was doing something that could bring a new dimension to her life, something she could really call her own. On the appointed day, they went to the clinic together. The atmosphere was full of hope and nervousness. The procedure was successful, and the doctor explained that the next step was to wait a few weeks to confirm the results. Isabel felt a mixture of relief and trepidation as they drove home. "Now all we can do is wait," Richard said, trying to sound confident, but Isabel could see the tension in his voice. Clarissa squeezed Isabel's hand gently. "It's going to be all right. I can feel it." A few weeks later, Isabel was at the clinic again, accompanied by Clarissa and Richard. The doctor entered the room with a discreet smile, and Isabel felt her heart race. "I have some good news," he began, looking directly at her. "The insemination was successful. Isabel, you're pregnant." Her eyes instantly filled with tears. "Pregnant?" she repeated, almost in disbelief. "And there's more," the doctor continued, with an amused twinkle in his eye. "It's not just one baby. It's 3. The silence that followed the revelation lasted only a moment before Clarissa let out a cry of pure joy. "Triplets?" Clarissa held Isabel's face in her hands, laughing and crying at the same time. "Oh, Isabel, you have no idea how much happiness this is going to bring to our home." Richard also seemed thrilled, something rare in his usually serious countenance. He squeezed Isabel's hand firmly. "We're very proud of you." Isabel, still in shock, placed her hand on her belly. A wave of emotions went through her: fear, happiness, disbelief. For the first time in a long time, she felt she was at the center of something great. The following months were marked by significant changes in Isabel's life. Clarissa was always by her side, making sure she had everything she needed. Richard, although more reserved, was attentive and careful, providing the best doctors and resources to ensure the health of Isabel and the babies. But above all, Isabel found comfort in her daily conversations alone with Theodore. She would spend hours by his bedside telling him about her pregnancy, her fears and her hopes. "Theodore, I know you probably can't hear me, but I wanted you to know that you're going to be a father." Her voice was low, full of emotion. "There are 3 babies, triplets." She held his hand gently, as if she wanted to transfer some of her strength to him. "I don't know what it will be like when they arrive, but I promise to take good care of them. And I promise to take care of you too." These conversations became part of Isabel's routine, a way of filling the emptiness she still felt. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Frances was still mulling over her last visit to the Blake mansion. Her frustration with Isabel only increased. She felt humiliated by her daughter's refusal to help her financially. William, however, remained silent until the day he heard by chance about Isabel's pregnancy. The news took him by surprise, but instead of anger or resentment, he felt something he hadn't expected: happiness. He decided to visit Isabel, but when he arrived at the mansion, he was met by Clarissa, who kept him in the living room and explained that Isabel needed to rest. Despite this, he was able to express his pride and his desire to be close to his daughter again. The months passed, and finally the big day arrived. Isabel went into labor in the middle of the night, and the house was gripped by a wave of frantic activity. Richard drove himself to take her to the hospital, while Clarissa held her hand in the back seat, trying to calm her down. "You're strong, Isabel. Everything will be fine." Hours later, the triplets were born. 2 boys and a girl, all healthy and perfect. Isabel cried as she held each of them for the first time, feeling a love she had never known before. Clarissa and Richard, thrilled, were always close by, celebrating the arrival of their grandchildren. The house, once silent and full of loneliness, was now alive with the sounds of babies. Isabel devoted herself completely to motherhood. Even though she was exhausted, she felt fulfilled by a greater purpose than she had ever imagined. When the triplets turned 3 months old, Isabel was in Theodore's room, holding one of the babies while the others slept in their cribs. She was still talking to Theodore, as she did every day. "They're getting so big," she smiled, looking at her son in her arms. "I so wish you could see them." Suddenly, Isabel noticed something. The sound of the machines seemed different. Her heart raced as she looked at Theodore, who was as still as ever. "Theodore," she called out, her voice trembling. Then his fingers moved. Isabel held her breath, unable to believe her eyes. Slowly, Theodore opened his eyes. He blinked a few times, as if trying to get his bearings. "What?" His voice was hoarse, weak, but clear enough to make Isabel's tears fall. Theodore looked around, confused, until his eyes landed on Isabel and the baby in her arms. Who are you?" he asked, his expression alternating between confusion and disbelief. Isabel tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Finally, she managed to whisper, "I'm Isabel, your wife." Theodore blinked again, even more confused. "My wife?" He looked at the baby, and then at Isabel, the shock evident on his face. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice still hesitant. Before Isabel could answer, the bedroom door opened, and Clarissa and Richard entered. Seeing Theodore awake, Clarissa put her hands to her mouth, her eyes full of tears. "Theodore," she ran to him, kneeling beside the bed. Theodore looked at his parents, then back at Isabel and the baby. "What happened to me?" he asked, more urgently now. "What is it?" Clarissa looked at Isabel, who seemed as frightened as he was. "Theodore," Clarissa began, holding his hand, "you've been in a coma for over a year, and while you were like that, your life changed." Theodore stared at Isabel again, his eyes wide. "Changed how?" Isabel took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Theodore, we're married, and you have 3 children." The room was silent for a moment that seemed eternal. Theodore blinked in disbelief as he tried to process what he had just heard. And now what will happen? How will Theodore cope with this unbelievable turn of events? Don't miss the continuation of this story full of drama and emotion. Leave your like, activate notifications by clicking on the bell, subscribe to the channel, and get ready for the most exciting episode yet. What's to come is not to be missed.